The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, Sam Berger of the Center for American Progress draws the parallels between Richard Nixon and Donald Trump and asks us to take a lesson from how the nation recovered from Watergate. Karen Hobert Flynn, the president of Common Cause, explains why a national popular vote is a better way to pick the next president. And Bill Press talks with Ironworkers General President Eric Dean. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. In the wake of Watergate, a wave of reforms were ushered in to repair a dysfunctional government and regain the public's trust in its leaders. Sam Berger is a policy analyst who says that moment in history has much to offer in the modern day. And we say hello to Sam Berger, senior advisor at the Center for American Progress, where he recently posted a report co-authored with Alex Tasanovich titled Lessons from Watergate, Preparing for Post-Trump Reform. Sam Berger, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
No problem. Thanks so much for having me.
Our pleasure to have you with us. Your report begins with a simple observation that many have compared the Trump administration to the presidency of Richard Nixon, and you agree the similarities are striking. Where do you see the resonance between these two presidents?
Well, I think with both of these presidents, you see a willingness to tap into the darker currents of the American political climate. You see a disregard for the rule of law, and you see an overriding concern with settling political scores and damaging perceived enemies. And I think the thing that's most important about both of these presidents, you hear this phrase, a culture of corruption. And I think people sort of think of that just meaning, oh, that's a lot of corruption. But it's actually more than that. It means that, when you have a corrupt president at the top, you then have this sort of notion that corruption is okay, corruption is the norm, corruption is something that should even be encouraged, permeate throughout a whole administration. You have a president who's dishonest and unethical, who puts a premium on personal loyalty. That's the kind of person who's then going to hire people in the administration who are dishonest and unethical. Right? People are going to be rewarded when they choose to look the other way or even aid in the sort of corruption. And people that basically call out the problems when they see them, that try and provide transparency, those people aren't going to advance. Those people are even going to be removed from the administration. And so over time, you get more and more corruption, and it starts to spread. And then you see lower officials basically mimicking their boss. Scott Pruitt is a perfect example of that. And so this is something that we saw with Nixon. It's something that we're seeing with Trump, and it's incredibly concerning and it's incredibly corrosive to our system.
Yeah, and way too eerily familiar. The purpose of the report is to bring into relief the way the nation responded to Watergate and suggests these responses provide a blueprint on how we may recover from the Trump administration. You begin with the concept of government transparency. Remind us how President Nixon was able to avoid transparency.
Sure. Well, one of the big issues was just that we didn't have a lot of the laws that I hope we have a chance to discuss later on today that came out of the post-Watergate era. So there just wasn't as much transparency. So you had secret campaign contributions from corporations. You had slush funds that those same corporations were using to bribe officials overseas. You had Nixon's own efforts to prevent Congress and the American people from seeing government records that would reveal the corrupt and, in some cases, criminal activity that he was engaged in. So part of what you see in the post-Watergate era is an effort to be clearer about what has to be revealed, requiring this transparency, in some cases, taking norms and making them into rules. And with any corrupt president, their corruption reveals holes in the system. And then you need to basically respond to those holes to fill them, to try and improve the system, to limit the ability of a future president to act in that same corrupt manner.
Mm-hmm. And Sam, what were some of the actions taken after Watergate to restore transparency in government?
So there's a wide range of them, but just to pick out a few, you had the Presidential Records Act. So prior to the passage of this law, the presidential papers were viewed as being the property of the president. They could take them with them, destroy them if they wanted to. There was very serious concerns with Nixon that he was going to do just that, destroy his records in order to hide from the American people what he had done, what other members of administration has done. So the Presidential Records Act put forward a pretty common sense notion. The records of the president, who we all hire to do this job, belong to the public, don't belong to the president. And it creates a system for preserving them and eventually releasing them. Then you had FOIA reform. FOIA is incredible. This is Freedom of Information Act. This is an incredibly powerful tool for finding out what the government's doing, what it's saying, making sure that there's transparency and responsiveness to the people. Problem was that FOIA, as it stood, didn't have enough teeth. Basically, people would, the government would continually claim national security or other sorts of concerns and keep documents from folks. And what these reforms did was close that loophole, make clear that you can't say that something is a national security issue, basically, unless it's really a national security issue. It got judges to determine whether or not information was properly classified, so that this sort of process of overly classifying to hide embarrassing material rather than material that needed to be kept hidden because of its national security implications. And then you had the IG Act. This basically put people within each agency whose job it was to root out corruption and misuse of taxpayer dollars. These were folks that didn't report up the normal chain of command and had an incentive to basically hold agencies accountable. This is a huge issue, or rather a huge step taken. And in fact, many of the scandals that have been revealed in time since come from IG reports because they're close to these issues, they're dogged, and because of the structure that's created, they're basically not political appointees aren't able to tamp these down or get rid of the investigations.
Mm-hmm. Ethics, another important concept you address. We may not have to be reminded of President Nixon's ethical abuses, but again, how did government respond in the post-Nixon era?
Sure. So one big one was the Ethics in Government Act, the aptly named Ethics in Government Act. This created widespread transparency requirements, including mandatory financial disclosure for members of Congress, candidates, some high-level executive branch officials. It created the Office of Government Ethics, which is the first centralized overseer of executive branch ethics requirements. And it adopted into law some of the congressional ethics rules that had been put in place around things like limits on lobbying by former members. And then you have civil service reform. There's major civil service reform that occurred in the late 70s. And that also, one of the issues that we saw under Nixon was misuse of the government bureaucracy. This tried to insulate civil servants to a certain extent from the political process. It created an organized appeal process for adverse personnel actions. It set out a new system for performance-based pay and promotion, and it strengthened protections for whistleblowers against reprisal for revealing government misconduct. So those are some of the ways to bring ethics back into reassert the important role of ethics in government.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Sam Berger, the senior advisor at the Center for American Progress, where he recently posted a report co-authored with Alex Tasanovich titled Lessons from Watergate, Preparing for Post-Trump Reforms. Nixon, Sam, is also known for flying in the face of ethical campaign funding with secret campaign slush funds, illegal corporate contributions, a possible quid pro quo agreement with ITT. What changes occurred there as a result?
Sure. So the biggest one was in the area of campaign finance reform. And you see that just an enormous change in how we regulate campaigns. So you had the creation of the Federal Election Committee to overseeing a body to basically oversee the rules and make sure that people were following them. You saw the introduction of comprehensive limits on contributions to and expenditures by political campaigns. This is really the backbone of what we think of today as the campaign finance system, of the rules of the system. Another major change was the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So one of the things that they discovered when they were looking into some of these questionable donations that were made to the Nixon campaign by corporations was that they were made from the same slush funds that these corporations were using to bribe officials overseas. And the issue became, well, it wasn't entirely clear exactly whether or not this was legal. And so the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act made it clear you couldn't bribe foreign officials overseas, and it imposed accounting standards on U.S. companies to make sure that they would accurately record their transactions. We'd be able to keep track of whether or not they were violating the law. So those are sort of the two big ones.
We really had to learn a lot in a short amount of time. You also address abuse of power, because why stop with ethics and campaign funding? Not only by the government and by Nixon himself, the way he used his presidential power, and as you said before, it starts at the top. These abuses led to significant changes. What are some of the most important there?
Yeah, so one of the things that Nixon did was, so the government has access to vast amounts of information, and he tried to get his hands on that information in order to attack his political enemies. And so you saw this effort to try and limit the ways in which the government could misuse information. So a huge one is the Privacy Act, which deals with what the government can and can't do with the personal information it collects on all of us. This is basically the backbone of how we understand privacy protections in the government today. You have the Tax Reform Act, which made sure that IRS information, very sensitive information around people's taxes, can only be disclosed in very limited, specific circumstances, so that couldn't be abused or used to embarrass or threaten political enemies. You saw the passage of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, which comes up a lot. We're hearing a lot of discussions about that today, but that basically set the rules for how you conduct foreign intelligence. And, before then, this established a very clear framework for doing it for national security purposes within the United States, just to be precise. It created the FISA courts. You also saw the creation of select intelligence oversight committees in the Senate and House, so that Congress should basically keep an eye on what it was that the executive branch was doing. And this is because of the revelations of widespread abuses by intelligence agencies, including extensive domestic surveillance by the FBI and the CIA. This came out through the Church Committee. And then you had the War Powers Act. We sort of haven't even gotten to this, but Vietnam was obviously an incredibly important issue. Concerns around the president's behavior, some of the actions that he took. And in this case, this is sort of a direct response to the expanded military operations in Cambodia, the secret military operations in Cambodia. And when that came to light, Congress passed the War Powers Act, which was intended to reassert the role that Congress plays in initiating hostilities with foreign countries. So some pretty major changes in these areas.
Yeah, very significant. It seems that one of the reasons you wrote the report is kind of to remind the American people of this history. Do you feel it's been forgotten?
Well, I think, everyone obviously remembers Watergate, and it seems like every year or two someone tries to stick gate on another scandal to get people to focus on it. But I think that people have lost sight of just how widespread and important the reforms post-Watergate have been. So we didn't even get to this, but of course, you had a complete revamping of the congressional budget process that occurred as well because of abuses by Nixon. You had the National Emergencies Act, which deals with the manner in which the president can declare national emergencies and therefore be able to take extraordinary actions pursuant to various statutes. Just a wide range of reforms. And the reason it's important is because when you see these parallels and you see the sorts of holes in our system that are being revealed by the widespread corruption from the Trump administration, it's good to know that we went through this before, and what we need to be ready, and we need to basically learn those lessons, be ready to have a similarly broad response that we should focus not just on a few narrow issues, but understand that this is widespread corruption, which therefore requires an equally broad response.
Mm-hmm. And Sam, obviously, we don't know when or how this current administration will end, but you argue that we need to be prepared and not wait until it's over. What do you want to see happen?
I think what's critical is that folks start thinking now about what are the holes in our system that have been revealed, and not just specific instances in which Trump has been corrupt here or there, but the sort of deeper-seated problems. What's allowed this to happen? What's allowed, for example, this sort of foreign influence operation? Why have we seen the kind of corruption connected with corporations and the wealthy being able to dump tons of money into our political system? And recognize that there are deep structural problems that Trump didn't necessarily create, but has revealed. And in revealing them, it provides an opportunity to address them. But we're not going to do it if people don't start thinking big and start thinking big now. Trying to figure out how these things all connect. What are the real issues that have been revealed, and what is it that we need to do to address them? I think there's a tendency for folks to get caught up in the moment, and I think it is, of course, of critical importance to people that are opposing some of the disastrous policies that we see coming out of this administration every day. That's critical work. Folks that are out there right now knocking on doors, making calls, that sort of thing. Incredibly important work for policymakers. It's important that they begin thinking now for how to fix some of these problems, because the worst thing that happened would be we said, at the end of this administration, people just say, okay, well, that was sort of an anomaly, move on. And then we find ourselves back here, with another demagoguing president, corrupt demagoguing president, making the exact same mistakes. And so there's going to be a moment, and to properly seize it, people need to start preparing now.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, I want to talk to you about several events currently in the news. The first is the potential appointment of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court and serious concerns that he will not act to hold a president fully accountable to the rule of law. Do you share those concerns?
Yeah, I think we've seen a president who's been very clear about how he views the role of the Justice Department, the justice system itself, which is a tool that he can use to punish those he doesn't like and help those that he does. And so the question becomes, Brett Kavanaugh has pretty extreme views on with respect to the ability of a president to interfere in an investigation, the questions about the president's use of the pardon power in order to obstruct justice or put himself above the law, the role that the executive branch can play in investigating the president, and whether or not the president has to comply with aspects of the judicial process, legal processes like subpoenas and the like. One of the things that I've been concerned about is that we haven't heard a strong declaration from the nominee about the fact that the president isn't above the isn't above the law. Rather, he sort of said those exact words, but when pushed on particulars, which is really where it matters, he's demurred. Say, I can't talk about that, or it's not appropriate. And given the unique situation we're in which a president who himself has been accused of being a co-conspirator in a felony by his own lawyer, simultaneously is the subject of a multi-person investigation into whether or not he conspired with a foreign adversary to undermine our elections. The notion that he's now appointing a judge who can rule on cases that directly result and implicate those investigations, and that judge, or who would then be justice if confirmed, refuses to recuse himself and refuses to basically make clear that he would actually hold the president accountable and make sure that he's not above the law. It's extremely concerning.
Mm-hmm. Borderline scary. Lastly, I want to ask you about recent revelations in Bob Woodward's book and in an anonymous op-ed in the New York Times that suggests there is a group of senior administration officials actively intervening to prevent the president from taking actions that would harm the nation. You've worked in government as a senior policy advisor at the White House Domestic Policy Council and in senior positions at OMB. Could you have ever imagined anything like the scenario that we're now hearing about.
I mean, it's incredible. So, one of the stories is taking something off the president's desk. One of my roles at the Office of Management and Budget was clearing every executive order and presidential memorandum before it went to the president. So it would go through a process at OMB, and then it would go to the staff secretary who would run the final process within the White House, and then it would go to the president for signature. And the reason we spent all this time, had all this input, had this elaborate process is that once something goes to the president, that's it. I mean, you can always, of course, in our case, go to him and say, we need to take this back. We made a mistake. But that's something, that's basically the worst day of your life if you have to do this. The notion that you would have senior advisors just taking things off the desk in order to influence policy, it's terrifying. But I think what's equally terrifying is that you have a president that's putting people in that position, namely that's putting forward policies and ideas, if we can call them ideas, irritable mental gestures, that force people of his own party that he's appointed to feel like they need to intervene on behalf of the American people. It's a terrifying situation, and I think it reveals a deep rot in the current Republican Party, a deep rot that allowed this man to become the nominee, to become president, and that has caused so many people in the administration to refuse to stand up and say something. The right thing to do is to resign. Right, is to resign and tell the American people what you're witnessing and the concerns that you have. There may be certain people in very particular national security positions who feel like they must stay in order to prevent, truly catastrophic issues, and I think that there's a good point to be made there. But for the vast majority of folks, if you don't like what you're seeing, and you shouldn't, if you're upset about somebody that is siding with white supremacists, that's advancing an incredibly racist set of policies towards immigrants, and it's encouraging people to view the media as the enemy of the people, and you should be. I mean, there's an attack on core American values. You should resign. You should tell the American people what you're seeing. You should make it clear this man is unfit. I think that writing an anonymous op-ed isn't really the way to go about doing it.
Yeah, I mean, it is scary, and what I don't understand are the people that are just members of Congress and in the Senate that don't stand up when they have to know better, and that scares me a lot. Sure, I mean it's an open secret. There's no confusion. It's not you don't ever hear anybody in Congress say, "Oh, that's not the Donald Trump that I know and love." They recognize that he's unstable. That he knows very little about policy, that he makes rash judgments that threaten to undermine America's standing in the world. But they're just more concerned about helping out their donors and getting their judges appointed than actually standing up for this country. And it's incredibly disappointing to see. It is. I think it's the thing that, if someone had said that we would be in this place 2 or 3 years ago, if you had suggested that the Republican Party, or to be clear, elected members of the Republican Party would capitulate this much to someone who's acting so contrary to American values, I think rightly people would say, I don't believe it. There would be a limit. There's no way that they would go this far. But here we stand, and I think what's even more concerning is we don't even seem to be hitting the end point. I think a lot of us, I think a lot of the American people are concerned that there's really no length that this president could go to that would cause Republican members of Congress to stand up to him. And I think that's why you're seeing such an outpouring of support for a Democratic Congress to have a check on this president, some means within the federal system, the federal government, to oppose what we all see as a dangerous president who's undermining values that are core to this country. Midterms aren't far away, folks. Please get out and vote. Sam Berger, senior advisor at the Center for American Progress, where he recently posted a report and was on with us to talk about it, co-authored with Alex Tosanovich, titled Lessons from Watergate, Preparing for Post-Trump Reforms. Sam, thank you so much for your time today on America's Democrats podcast. We look forward to hearing back from you again soon. Thanks so much. You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But We need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure,
I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, can a movement to elect the president by who wins the most popular votes actually succeed? We'll find out in just a moment. First, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Corporate acolytes and right-wing moralists constantly preach to laboring stiffs about the uplifting dignity of work. Of course, that's dignity as defined and controlled by corporate elites, not by workers, and the reward for it frequently includes on-the-job injuries and death. Not that CEOs and well-heeled investors intend to sicken, maim, and kill thousands of laborers every year, but they certainly do put them in positions that assure such unhappy results. For example, they demand that farm workers go sunrise to sunset picking crops in California's 105-degree desert heat, and that construction crews toil in the muggy dog days of Florida summers, tarring condo roofs. Low-paid, powerless workers die, but no one in the corporate hierarchy did the deed, right? Heat was the killer. But wait, not only are aloof, air-cool bosses the ones who knowingly subject subordinates to deadly heat, but they're also the ones who hire squads of lobbyists and lawyers to kill simple, inexpensive rules to stop these deaths. Such rules as requiring ample water at work sites, ensuring paid rest breaks in cool spaces, training on-site managers and employees to detect and react to signs of heat stress, and imposing serious punishments for violators. Such sensible steps have repeatedly been proposed as official workplace policy for at least the last 50 years. But intense industry lobbying has killed the adoption of all attempts to prevent what amounts to workplace murder by corporate profiteers. Instead, the U.S. government pretends to protect workers by printing posters admonishing employees to beware of heat, basically telling them goodbye and good luck. This is Jim Hightower saying, but at last a real proposal has been put on the table by more than 110 grassroots groups. See it and join it by contacting Public Citizen, citizen.org. Howdy-ho, folks. Thanks for tuning in and sharing my weekly commentaries. Also, please join me for a live web show I host every other Tuesday, the Hightower Lowdown Happy Hour at the Chat and Chew Cafe. You can join the action live online as I chat with grassroots leaders and progressive sparklies from around the country. Go to hightowerlowdown.org/chat-and-chew to find out about upcoming guests and watch past episodes. That's hightowerlowdown.org/chat-and-chew.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Karen Hobert Flynn leads one of the nation's leading organizations dedicated to strengthening democracy. That's why she says it's time for the nation to change the way we elect our president. And we say hello to Karen Hobert Flynn, who's the president of Common Cause, one of several organizations supporting the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. Karen, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure to have you with us. So let's start with the basics. What is the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact?
So first, I should say that the current system has the candidate we would expect the candidate with the most popular votes to be elected president, just like every other election. But unfortunately, that is not the way our system works. Electing the president is not done that way. The current system uses the Electoral College, where electors select who's going to be president. And the challenge is that states are given the authority of how they allocate those votes. Most states, 48 states, allocate those based on a winner-take-all strategy of who wins the popular vote in that state. What happens is that we don't have the winner of the popular vote across the country electing the president. And so what happens as a result of that is we see candidates really just focusing most of their time and energy campaigning in states where they're battleground states that can make a big difference. And so we have had in our history 5 different times when the candidate who placed second in the popular vote elected as president. Once in 2016, so that was just very recently, in 2000, in 1888, 1876, and 1824. And so 5 of the last 12 presidential elections, we could see also if we shifted a handful of votes in 1 or 2 states, we could have also elected the second place candidate. And so it disenfranchises voters in more than 2/3 of the states who don't live in these battleground states. Mm-hmm. The presidential candidates don't really have reason to visit or poll or advertise or organize in most states. And so just in 2016 alone, we saw 68% of the campaign visits were in just 6 states. And they 2/3 of, or actually 94% of 2016 events were in 12 states. And so that means in Florida, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Virginia, Michigan, and other battleground states, there's a lot of activity. And most of the other states see no interest from presidential candidates. And in a lot of ways, their votes don't matter in the election of the president. And that isn't really democracy.
And that creates that attitude of my vote doesn't count.
That's right.
There's that part of it.
There is. And, I do think polls show that people believe that the president should be elected by the national popular vote. And there's widespread support of that. But we also see people believe that their votes don't matter. And so 44% of the voting age population didn't vote in the 2016 election. That's a huge portion of our voting age population. And for a democracy, that should not be the way our elections are run.
Absolutely. In a piece that you wrote for the Daily Beast back in 2016, you stated that the National Popular Vote Compact is in keeping with the spirit of our nation's charter, in other words, our Constitution. What did you mean by that?
When we look at even the preamble of the Constitution, we talk about we the people of the United States established the Constitution for the United States of America. And our Constitution rests on the idea of popular sovereignty, that a government in which the people's voice and the people rule. And when we have a system to elect our president that ignores such a huge portion of our population, it's a real problem. NPR did an analysis in 2016, and they found that it's possible to win the Electoral College with just 23% of the popular vote using the Electoral College. That is an incredibly small portion of the population, and it means that for many other states, 38 states are flyby states. They are states that are ignored. And so that's a real problem for our democracy. And there are ways to fix it. And actually the Interstate Compact, the National Popular Vote Compact, is a way to fix that process. It would...
Sorry, please go ahead. No, you go ahead.
it would make all votes equal. It would ensure that the candidate with the most votes win the election, just like in other elections that we have in our country, like the elections for governor. It would bring candidates to every state and make them listen to everyone's concerns, not just those that are in battleground states, which tend to be whiter, more rural. It would give voters in all states, regardless of their party affiliation, an incentive to vote in presidential elections, and, frankly, would help get out the vote in all states and in all elections. And I think that it would really rid the nation of these falsely polarized red and blue election night maps that we see, where we're looking at, how presidential candidates are racking up votes in a red or a blue state to get to the 270 votes they need to win the Electoral College.
I was going to mention that on the Common Cause website, there's a detailed list of the problems with our Electoral College. You were touching on some of that just a second ago. What are some of the other more significant problems with the current Electoral College?
One of the things is that it means that that battleground states get most of the attention. We also see the battleground states, you will see, are more likely to get money when there are federal emergencies, that there are more benefits that accrue to their states because both when candidates are campaigning there and once elected, they're more likely to do favors for battleground states. And so, that is not, it is not a fair system, and it's one that discounts so many people across the country. It means that not every vote is equal, so that most Americans are completely irrelevant in presidential elections. And so that, I think, is a huge problem. And we also see it can impact how people vote. So young adults in swing states are 30% more likely to vote than young people in the rest of the nation. And so it has a real impact on how people participate. So one of the positive things about this is something that we can fix without amending the Constitution. We can use a national popular vote contract, an interstate compact, where states come together and say that they will award their electors to the winner of the national popular vote. And so what that means is that they each pass a state law that enables them to enter into a legally enforceable contractual obligation to allocate their electoral votes to the winners of the national popular vote. And once we get to enough states passing this interstate compact through their legislature and signed by the governor in their state, then when we get to enough states for 270 electoral votes, those votes will be allocated to the winner of the national popular vote, thereby ensuring that we have a national popular vote winner. And so it doesn't abolish the Electoral College. You don't have to amend the Constitution. You just do this compact. And so we've seen 12 states in the District of Columbia pass this interstate compact over the last number of years. So they have 172 electoral votes committed to this national popular vote compact, and they just need 98 more electoral votes for this to become this interstate compact to be in operation. So that is very exciting, and we've seen bipartisan support moving these kinds of reforms. In fact,
that is so impressive.
It is. Just a few months ago, Connecticut was the latest state to pass the National Popular Vote Compact.
There are, of course, many myths about the national popular vote. One is that smaller states will lose their vote. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, it's interesting because the popular elections would give small states a bigger voice. So if you look at the smallest states, 12 of the 13 smallest states in the country are actually sidelined in presidential elections as they currently stand because they're not competitive. So Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, North and South Dakota, Alaska, they usually vote Republican, and then Rhode Island, Delaware, Maine, Vermont, Hawaii, and D.C. usually vote Democratic. And so what happens is these are never battleground states, and we don't see presidential candidates going there. And if you took all of those states and the District of Columbia, you would have about 11 million people and 40 electoral votes. And Ohio, which is a battleground state, has about 11 million people also and only 20 electoral votes. But the people in Ohio have significantly more impact because that is a battleground state where presidential candidates spend millions of dollars campaigning. And so they just have much more influence. So if we were to move to national popular vote compact, these smaller states, their votes would matter. And so I think that's really important. And if you look in large states like Florida, for example, or in Ohio, when presidential candidates go to those states, they travel all over the state. So they're not just going to big cities or a few urban centers. They also go in small, medium, and large towns. So they campaign all over the state. And so if we were to open up the system by passing a national popular vote compact, we would have candidates traveling all over the country because they want to get as many votes as they can of the national popular vote because that's what's going to determine whether they win or not.
Mm-hmm. And it's not like they don't have enough time because we start the process for running for offices now soon after an election occurs, and so we're on to the next election. So they got
That's
plenty
really
of time
true.
to visit all these different states. Well, another myth is that a national popular vote is an anti-Republican idea. True or not true?
That's not true. It's not true at all. And in fact, we see support for national popular vote and bipartisan support for national popular vote in many of the states that are engaged. In fact, in September, there have been bills introduced, companion bills in the House and Senate in Michigan, and the 25 senators in the state Senate include 15 Republicans and 10 Democrats, and they're supporting national popular vote. Some Republicans believe that our current system benefits Democratic presidents over Republicans. And so that is one of the reasons that they look at it. Many others want to see, people from all across the country and small states and large states that are not battleground states to have their voices heard. So we have seen support for this, across the aisle. I will say that recent elections can sometimes have an impact. So when George W. Bush won in 2000, he lost the popular vote but won the electoral vote. Support for an idea like national popular vote dipped a little. And then as you moved further away from the election, people looked at the actual reform itself and thought less about the election that they had just participated in and saw the real benefits of a national popular vote. And likewise, in 2016, when Donald Trump did the same thing, there was a dip in Republican support shortly after that, but we are starting to see, once again, Republicans and Democrats moving these national popular vote bills in states across the country.
I mean, it is supposed to be about what the people want, and the president and everybody else that's in offices. I mean, you're representing those people, so you should be listening to those people. And gosh, a national popular vote would certainly take care of that. But of course,
right.
We're not done talking about myths. Perhaps the most pervasive myth is that a national popular vote goes against the Constitution. That can't be true.
It is not true. And in fact, the Constitution squarely says that it is up to the states to decide how to allocate their electors. So this is clearly defined in the Constitution as belonging to the states. And so states at any time can change how they allocate their electors' votes. So we don't have to amend the Constitution. You don't need to abolish the Electoral College. Doing an interstate compact, and there are hundreds of interstate compacts, is a way to fix this problem without having to change the Constitution in any way.
We're speaking with Karen Hobert Flynn, who's the president of Common Cause, and talking today about the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. Karen, where is the greatest resistance to a national popular vote?
You know, there are some groups on the right that have opposed National Popular Vote Compact, and probably one of the best examples is the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC. ALEC has been a secretive collaboration between businesses and conservative politicians where they come together and behind closed doors ghostwrite model bills that they introduce in state capitals across the country. And so their agenda is often pro-business, anti-environmental, and actually anti-reform. So they used to have a segment, a committee that focused on putting up barriers to people being able to vote. So, battling online voter registration and automatic voter registration and other reforms that would give people more access to be able to have their voices heard in elections. And so they have an anti-reform agenda, and one of those things was opposing a national popular vote. In some ways, I think that they are less interested in the people's voice in our democracy and more interested in how the wealthy and corporate interest can get more of what they want passed, whether it's gutting minimum wage or getting loopholes for big industries and the super rich. And so I would say that is probably the most powerful and challenging opposition that we faced on this measure.
Your effort is the result of a coalition of organizations calling for the end of the Electoral College. Who are some of the members of this coalition?
It's a terrific coalition, and I would first say National Popular Vote. And if you went to nationalpopularvote.com, you can see it was one of the founding organizations that conceived of this interstate compact, and there's lots of great information, and they track what's happening in states. We also work with Fair Vote, AARP, groups like the Sierra Club, the NAACP, many labor organizations, the Democracy Initiative. There are new groups coming into this issue, too, a new group called Make Every Vote Count. Lots of activists from Indivisible and other groups that are really interested in engaging in these issues as well.
Now, this is hardly the first time Americans have questioned the validity of the Electoral College, and certainly in those two recent elections in 2016 and 2000, it was discussed. What gives you hope that now is the time when change is actually within reach?
What gives me hope is that I have seen more people engaging at this moment in history in issues around democratic structural issues because of the huge challenges we've seen with the 2016 election and the Trump administration challenging our democratic norms and values and institutions. Many people came out to resist and fight back against that. But also, they have wanted to engage in passing reforms that give people stronger voice in their democracy. And so National Popular Vote has been one of those issues where people that have never been involved before are coming out of the woodwork saying, this is something we need. This is something that needs to pass. And that's what gives me hope. I have never seen this kind of activism, and I've been doing this work for more than 30 years, this kind of activism around democracy, and it's inspiring.
Before we let you go, on the Common Cause website, visitors are asked to sign a letter to their state lawmakers. Tell us what the letter says, and how can listeners find it?
So the letter talks about contacting your member of Congress to say, and your state legislators, and to say, we want you to pass a national popular vote compact. And to link to the letter, you just need to go to www.commoncause.org/NPV, which stands for National Popular Vote. And if you do that, you can sign into the letter and send it to your state legislators. And we hope that you will engage in this very important fight. There are opportunities to move this in a number of state legislatures, and we will be fighting in many states come 2019. Places like Oregon, Delaware, New Mexico, Nebraska, Michigan, Arizona, and many other states. So we hope you'll join us in this fight.
And again, folks, I encourage you to go to commoncause.org/NPV for National Popular Vote to get more information, to get in touch with your state senators and congressmen, and we really need to make this happen. It's long overdue. Karen Hobert Flynn, president of Common Cause, joining us today to talk about the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. Karen, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it, and we look forward to having you back again soon with a positive update, I hope.
Oh, great. I'd love to do that. Thank you.
You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Greg Craig, it's good to reconnect with you again. Thanks for joining us today on the Bill Press Pod.
Glad to be here, Bill.
Well, before we get into all the back and forth about what happened in Mar-a-Lago and how serious is it, I want to back up and just ask you kind of some basic questions, which a lot of people, I guess, don't understand, about the issue of presidential records. I mean, presidential documents. How important are they, and who do they belong to?
Well, they're important enough that Congress decided in 1978 that they were going to pass a law that took away private ownership of presidential records and put the ownership in the National Archives. And of course, some presidential records are more important than others. But as a general matter, the preservation and maintenance of presidential records ever since Richard Nixon's administration has been very, very important. And every president has had to set up a system within his or her White House to comply with the requirements of the Presidential Records Act.
Right. So this came after Watergate, right? After Nixon.
The date was 1978 that the law was passed. Richard Nixon left government in 1974, and there was an election in between in which Jimmy Carter was elected. With the Democratic majorities, I think, but it was largely bipartisan. Everybody seemed to respect the notion that presidential records would no longer be owned privately by the president or the former president, but would be owned by the American public through the National Archives.
And when you say presidential, we say presidential documents or records. So what does that include? What's covered? Is it every scrap of paper in and out of the White House?
No, it's not. But it's every scrap of paper that has to do with the president performing his core functions. And more than paper, it's anything that's electronic as well, or mechanical records, audio, visual, electronic. So documents has the broadest possible definition. And it has to do with documents that are created or received by the president or his staff that have to do with the basic function of the president carrying out the constitutional, statutory, or other official duties of the president. It does not include personal records. And for example, when I was working in President Obama's administration, we took care to set up a system whereby he could keep his personal records separate and apart from the presidential records, both in his electronic communications as well as in his telephone communications. But personal records that are purely private or non-public and do not relate to the constitutional or statutory duties of the president are not covered. But everything else really is. And to be safe and certain and sure about complying with the law, the presumption in most administrations has been, if it's a document you're using while you're working, it's a presidential record.
Yeah. So, for example, the president's emails back and forth with his friends from Chicago, right? But that would not have been covered. Everybody knew that. Yeah.
I think he had a private email mechanism that he would turn to, that we then also set up. You're talking about President Obama.
Yes.
That could be reviewed by a completely independent person to make sure that these were private and personal communications having to do with, I'll meet you in Chicago for dinner, or
right.
you coming in, or by the way, it's your birthday, happy birthday, stuff like that.
Yeah.
And we set up a system whereby he could have a private email and telephone communication through, I think it was the BlackBerry at the time.
Right.
That was that we could then certify was really personal and completely private.
Oh, so you were White House counsel. What kind of a system did you set up to make sure on a daily basis that this Presidential Records Act was complied with?
Well, first of all, I had been in the Clinton administration and seen a little bit about how Chuck Ruff and his team, he was White House counsel at the time, had set that up. And so I realized that the first thing we needed was someone who knew his P's and Q's. And so we hired Norm Eisen, who now regards himself and identifies himself as the ethics czar for the Obama administration in the first term. And Norm was the person designated to be responsible for essentially providing instruction and guidance to every member of the White House staff, the executive office of the presidency, on ethics as well as how to comply with the requirements of the President's Record Act. And so I can recall we had, and the one word that was descriptive of what Norm Eisen required of every member of the staff was mandatory. These briefings were mandatory, and people had to attend them. They were not all by Norm, by the way. We also brought over the archivist, who I think to a fare thee well, probably 2 or 3 times, briefed the executive office staff of the president about compliance with the Presidential Records Act.
Right. So could Norm or could you, did either of you or anyone there have the power to override the Presidential Records Act?
No, I wouldn't.
This becomes key for what we're going to talk about next, right? But
no, I mean, our concern was making sure that the people that were working with me in the White House counsel's office complied with the Presidential Records Act and did not engage in either destruction of presidential records or shoddy or sloppy maintenance of presidential records. And so the issue of, is this a presidential record or is it not, didn't really come to my desk as I had to rule, this is not, this is, I'm going to overrule Norm Eisen. No, it was, we were setting up a system of compliance, Bill, and that was what we tried to do.
Right. Which it appears was not necessarily the case, to say the least, with the Trump administration. So let's go back to August 8. The FBI arrives in Mar-a-Lago. The former president is not there, and they conduct this search of the grounds of Mar-a-Lago and the various buildings there, and carry off 15 boxes of what they said were pretty sensitive documents. Was that an appropriate search? Was it legal? First of all, was it legally carried out, and who authorized it?
Well, I think there were 20 boxes,
Uh-huh.
and it was, as far as I can tell from everything that I've read about the search, it was very carefully carried out. And I've seen nothing, at least in the press or in the media coverage, to make me think that there was any violations of any Fourth Amendment rights. Let's begin by
What did they need to do the search? Start there, I guess. Huh?
well, as we've been listening to for the last 3 weeks,
Mm-hmm.
you have to have a sufficient evidence to establish probable cause that a crime was committed, and then you have to have sufficient evidence to convince a judge that evidence of that crime is in the location that you're planning to search. And so that search warrant, which went to a magistrate by the name of Bruce Reinhardt in Florida to review, was the first test as to the legality of the search. And it's important to recognize that the Attorney General, after the search had been conducted, held a press conference in which he stated, without any conditions, that he had been responsible for authorizing the search warrant. I assume with Merrick Garland, he reviewed the search warrant as well as the affidavit, and authorized that it be taken to a federal judge. And as we know about Merrick Garland, he is a cautious man. He is a careful man. He is measured and not known to take impulsive actions.
Right.
And he's careful to the extent that he's completely apolitical to the frustration of many people on all sides. And so when he said, I myself reviewed that document, that application for a search warrant, and authorized it, that gives me some sense, and anybody who knows the system gives you some sense, that all the T's were crossed and all the I's were dotted.
So we've seen the search warrant. We have not seen the affidavit. It is now back in the hands of the Justice Department to tell Judge Reinhardt what they think they could release and what should not be released. What is your take from what we know, again? Is it appropriate to release the search warrant? Some have warned that this would jeopardize whatever investigation the Department of Justice is undertaking.
In my experience as a criminal defense lawyer, the affidavit is never released to the public if there's no prosecution, if there's no charges brought.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens then is, if there are materials that have been taken by the government, they are returned to the owner from where they were taken, and the inventory is all you need to establish that everything is as it should be. But the argument that the government has made against the release of the affidavit uses language that is really very extreme language. The protection of the integrity of an ongoing law enforcement investigation. There's not a judge in America that would take an action that, in the government's view, would jeopardize an ongoing law enforcement investigation that implicates national security. So the government of the United States is pulling out all the stops. They call it critically important and detailed investigative facts are in the affidavit. They say that there's highly sensitive information about witnesses, including witnesses interviewed by the government, specific techniques, information by law to be kept under seal. Those are all phrases that the government used in its opposition to unsealing the affidavit. And it'll take a courageous judge, in the view of that kind of language, not to comply with the government's request.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as you know, Bill, the judge has said, let's try redacting it.
Right.
Show me, if you can, what a redacted version of the affidavit would reveal. And I would bet you there are some things in that affidavit that can be revealed. For example, I would bet that there is a history or a narrative of the negotiations between the National Archivist and the Trump lawyers, followed up by the history of the government of the United States negotiation with the Trump lawyers, to show that there was a good faith effort without a search warrant to recover the materials that had been taken out of the White House improperly. So we might be able to get that much out of it. I doubt that we're ever going to get names of witnesses or identity information about witnesses that cooperated with the government. And I think it'll be heavily redacted if it is released.
I noticed that of course, the Justice Department has still a couple of days to get back to the judge with this proposed redactions or whatever. In the meantime, Judge Bruce Reinhart told some news source on Monday that he wanted everybody to know he had, using his phrase, carefully reviewed the FBI's sworn evidence, and that he did find the affidavit, the facts laid out in the affidavit, he said, called them reliable. That sort of tells you the judge is not inclined to go against whatever the Justice Department recommends. Do I read it correctly?
I think he's just talking about the credibility of the affidavit itself rather than what can be released and what can't be released. Mm-hmm. He's got to worry that if he says to the government of the United States, look, your redactions are too much. I want you to release information of paragraph 5 as well as paragraph 7 and the information contained in paragraph 8. The government of the United States does not have to comply with that. It can appeal to a district court judge over a magistrate. So this magistrate is not going to be the last word. Mm-hmm. And he's likely not to want to end up in a fight with the government of the United States over whether the redactions are adequate or not.
If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.